This episode is brought to you by Little Paddlers Swimming Academy. Little Paddlers was founded during the reign of Autarch Agitor, using the same instruction techniques perfected by the Order of Seekers of Truth and Penitence, to ensure that they didn't lose any apprentices during their periodic swims in the odorific Guile River. And since then, they've force-marched thousands of little malingerers to perfect skills that made the Torturers Guild the top-rated swimmers they are primarily known for today. And right now, when our listeners sign up their ankle biters for a series of introductory procedures lessons, they'll get a handy depth sensor, so after a few simple trigonometric calculations, your drowning youth vampire will be able to tell which way it is to the surface. Go to their website and sign up your grumpy broodling and use the promo code ReRead, one word. And thank you, Little Paddlers Swimming Academy, for sponsoring the ReReading Wolfe podcast.
Warning, the following discussion is deliberately riddled with spoilers and unhinged speculation on this nearly 40-year-old book, Gene Wolfe's The Book of the New Sun. You can't read a Gene Wolfe story. You can only reread a Gene Wolfe story.
Welcome to ReReading Wolfe. We'll abandon the literary artifice that this is the first time you and we've read these books. We're going to try and understand, and that means considering the books as a whole.
I'm James Wynn.
And I'm Craig Brewer. Our first episode has been out for about a week or 2 weeks when we're recording this, and we wanted to say thank you to those people who listened already. We didn't know how long it would take people to get around to it, but after just the first episode, or first 2 episodes, I guess, if the first one really counts, and 1 chapter, then we've already gotten a lot of good feedback. So thank you very much.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, one person has already given us a review on iTunes.
A 5-star rating from a listener named Marble Fortress.
And we will read reviews on here if you leave something for us, both good or bad, but we're going to save that for the end because we know you want to get to the good stuff right now.
Yeah.
Also, if you do have other questions or concerns or errata, which I think is a good word, especially since in Lexicon Earthis, that Michael Andrews published errata sheets, that we certainly want to hear about your own errata notes that you want to give us. And we already have one. We've already got a possible correction.
Wrong, when you feel so much you're right, you may discover that you're wrong.
This one came in on Facebook.
Yeah, it was Ian C. Smith.
Ian Smith wrote after some thanks and said he was enjoying it, said, hope it's okay to start with the disputation. In the discussion of the first chapter, you suggest, if I've understood you right, that there's an inconsistency in the numbers of volunteers described as being at the gate because of the line, and there were only 2 left, being followed shortly after by a description indicating there were still several volunteers present. However, I'm pretty sure the first reference is actually to 2 lanterns, not 2 volunteers.
Wow.
So we had put this forward as the second time that Severian gets something wrong, perhaps in his memory.
Well, you put yourself out there, Ian. Let's you're setting yourself up for some universal scorn and approbation right in front of everybody. So let's take a look at the text. Let's see here. The man with the key had dropped the lantern when he ran after Iada, and there were only 2 left. In the dim light, the volunteer looked stupid and innocent. I suppose he was a laborer of some kind. I think maybe he's right.
He may well be. There's a question of reference there, but when it, if it was just the sentence that said then there were only 2 left, that leaves it vague. But then when the next sentence is all about
in the dim light, yeah. Yes. Okay. All right. Well done.
That's 1 point. 1 point in favor of the people who want to make sure that Severian's memory is perfect. so now we just got to prove that the Draught and Roach was a typo and that all the other things going on.
All falling apart.
But no, thank you very much for that. We do want to make sure that when we're saying things, we're not misreading the text or sort of getting in our own little echo chamber between the 2 of us. So thank you very much. And if you do have bigger questions or concerns or disagreements for important reasons about, bigger points that we make too, both from the sentence level to larger issues, we would love to hear it.
As it turns out, I would like to get in line. So I didn't catch this for some reason, but it is not St. Ignatius that referred to the Severians, the spin-off Gnostic sect that I had come upon in Eusebius's The History of the Church. It was Saint Irenaeus in his work Against Heresies.
Gotcha.
That's just small stuff. I also managed to say that Iada was not an apprentice because he was too young. And this is ridiculous, since Iada is the apprentice Severian chose as his second when he became captain of the apprentices. I suppose it is possible that a child younger than 6 is not officially an apprentice since he has no duties, but I don't know what a boy like that would be called. Maybe a little kid, or more likely by others, he'd be called a little apprentice.
Good. And one other thing that someone brought up, not necessarily a correction, but in addition, Christopher Merwin also on Facebook had mentioned that there was not just a Saint Severian, but actually an Emperor Severian in late Roman history, or not Severian, but Severus. And fits perfectly that there is a character who's both a saint and an emperor that can also have his name connected to chopping heads off. So, yeah. So thanks for the addition, because I had not thought of that one at all. I want to mention one other thing that came up when we spoke with Nigel Price, actually just this last week, who is one of the co-runners of the website Alton's Library. He's going to be our first special guest. So that's coming up for Chapter 6 and Master of the Curators. Something to look forward to. But he mentioned that resurrection can also literally mean grave robbing. And resurrection men is kind of a common name for grave robbers, a traditional name too. So there is a literal resurrection that does happen in that first chapter. You can make those kinds of comments on Facebook, on Twitter, or you can always email us. We do have an email, rereadingwolfe@gmail.com. No dashes, no hyphens, just rereadingwolfe@gmail.com. If you don't want to do it publicly, feel free to send us an email there and we'll get back to you or mention you here.
Well, I think that was awesome. Chapter 2, Severian. Can we talk about something before we begin this chapter?
Absolutely.
So you want to talk about Nessus? That's another odd name for anyone to call the city.
Nessus, yeah. Get into the name of the city and what city it might actually be related to. I mean, so first of all, we could assume that it's just a science fiction city. It's far, far in the future. It might not have some connection. We also know that there are plenty of things that are connected to actual places.
It is a name of a centaur in mythology. He was killed by a poisoned arrow by Hercules. And so his blood poisoned his own shirt, and then he tricked Hercules' wife into getting Hercules to wear it, which killed him. Incidentally, Centaurus was not a centaur, but a deformed man who lived among horses and had sex with them. He sired the race of centaurs. That is the mythical version. That's not some later rationalization of the story. And Severian's time-traveling robot friend, Jonas, said that the city was called that because the water was poisoned. Before that, it was called something else, but if he knew what that was, he didn't say. Now, first of all, I'm very unsatisfied by that connection. It's okay, but it doesn't really measure up to what I'm used to from Wolfe.
I think the centaur imagery is really good just because it's a hybrid. And it's a mishmash of all kinds of things. And also kind of, especially with that version that you just told of how the centaur came about, it's kind of a perversion. It's and it's a degenerate form. But so it really works that what we have here is sort of a society that is now kind of a hodgepodge of a whole bunch of things that people have forgotten their meaning. They've forgotten the reasons behind a lot of the things. And they've still got all these traditions that are kind of a mess. And I think it works for that. It also doesn't connect to any sort of real geography. I would say most of us would want to try and figure out, where this actually is, or at least could be. And we get the river, we get directions with north and south. We know that we're in the southern hemisphere somewhere, or at least that, what they're calling north and south. And the way that it's, colder to the south and warmer to the north.
People have said Byzantium. People have said, I think, was it Michael Andre Gerisi who said Madagascar? Was that who said that?
That was me. I was joking about it.
I could have swore he did a joke about that somewhere on the Earth list. But I think the consensus is that it is Buenos Aires. I think Jonas's story is kind of a false etymology that he put together just the way the reader would. He knew that Nessus was connected to mythology. He knew there was poison. He saw that the water that ran through Nessus was poisoned. So he put a few things together. And that's just the way I would have put together something like that. Oh, it probably has something to do with the poison.
The myth by itself doesn't necessarily point to a particular place, though, does it? I mean, we can get that name.
No,
for one
thing, it's in Greece. It's not a place name. It's a person's name.
Yeah, so that by itself, it can still have that meaning and still be Buenos Aires. So that's
right.
That's not
right. Exactly. The preponderance of theories is that it is Buenos Aires. Buenos Aires Nessus. That I wouldn't necessarily be convinced of that personally. I mean, it's not bad, but I'd probably want more. The reason it is in South America, right? The preponderance of understanding is that it's in South America because of certain South American cultural references, and not the least is the type of soup everyone is drinking, mate
or tea, yeah,
right, and also the Argentinian National Public Library that was headed by Jorge Luis Borges, who. I accept Master Alton of Chapter 6 is an allusion to him. That all kind of fits together very nicely. But the reason that I'm convinced is, frankly, the river that runs through Nessus, the Gaiol. The river that runs through Buenos Aires is the Uruguay River. Gaiol, Uruguay. Because if you accept that Buenos Aires is Nessus, then the Guayol fits perfect for the Uruguay River, and now you have completed your crossword puzzle.
And there's more to it than this, but let me say first of all that I'm probably like everyone else that when you hear about Great Big River, I usually just assume South America, it's the Amazon, and I think that's the easy connection, the sort of obvious one. But when you actually look at a map, like James did, you find some other things.
Yeah, the river that flows north away from Buenos Aires is the Uruguay River, the Gaiol. And once you know that, then you can follow that river up north to the little town of Salto Station, that is Saltus, where Severian's in Claw the Conciliator. And since Saltus is about 35 miles, 56 kilometers north of the northernmost part of Nessus, we can see that if Buenos Aires is Nessus, then it has traveled up the Uruguay River about 300 miles, as far as Nueva Escocia, Argentina. Jonas explains that the city is constantly moving north because the wealthy are seeking pure water. And no, I haven't identified Thrax at this point.
But one thing I do like about that is that it helps connect with the amount of time that's passed a little bit more. Because one thing that I think is always problematic about saying Nessus is Buenos Aires is that we're already seeing, civilization layered on top of civilization, layered on top of civilization, and the mines that come later. And the amount of time that's passed means for me that it'd be really hard to think that, where an exact city is now would have to be identified with another one. So to make a sort of one-to-one correlation between Nessus and Buenos Aires seems almost too simple for the kind of stuff that Wolfe's talking about. Like he seems more like at this amount of time and the way that he's thinking about it, the cities that we would recognize now would have been layered over a long time ago. But if we're assuming that at least general geographical things could still be around, then that river kind of makes sense. And then you can move the towns up and down the river. And the fact that Saltus is there, maybe Wolfe was looking at a map and thought, oh, that's a good name for where a mine was.
And that's pretty clever, actually. He didn't just come up with some messed up version of Buenos Aires. He managed to have some real word that the city could be named after or misnamed after.
So I like that. I like that quite a bit. Now do you want to talk about it now? We can sort of put a hint because you're going to.
You want to do this now?
There's no law that says it has to come at the end.
All right. Okay. Well, cue that Curiositas Earthus music.
Curiositas Earthus.
Alice K. Turner, a former early Earthlister, editor of fiction at Playboy magazine, who passed away unexpectedly about 4 years ago, never backed off her belief that Nessus is Alexandria in Egypt. Her reasons were St. Catherine was a patron saint of Alexandria and the great library there. And finally, that the main guilds, the Mattachin, the Bear, Witches, etc., seemed to her to refer to specific ancient pharaohs. She admitted that that last one was a little far-fetched. And she also acknowledged that her mapping might more likely reflect her own psychology than the state of mind that Wolfe had when he wrote the book. But she suggested that the continent of Africa moved north and the Mediterranean Sea had dried to a river flowing south and east from the Alps. And then she had us imagine that the entire area migrated south. And she imagined that Severian's whole journey northward goes from Alexandria to Switzerland. She liked the sorcerer's village to be in Albania. Mm-hmm. I'm going to put a link to her explanation from the Earth list in the show notes. The lesson here is that finding yourself on the Curitas Earthis shelf is a position of significant pedigree.
Yeah. If that name's not familiar to you and you were never a member of the Earth list or only kind of dabbled or were a recent addition when very little's going on there, it's well worth your time just to go back and search for her posts just because there's so much. What was her?
Alga was her nickname.
I was going to ask. I had momentarily forgotten her long son nickname. Yeah.
Being an early lister, she had a long son nickname. She never liked the Nessus Buenos Aires link. She dropped off the list. I don't know if you remember, but she dropped off the list with the publication of the final volume of The Wizard Knight, due directly to Wolfe's rather graphic description of how, in a fairy world, a marriage between a giant and a human woman might work, which does happen in the stories, especially the Germanic stories in which that fantasy world was taking place. But it was just too much for her. As I recall, her last words were something like, "That's it, yeah. I've had it."
Yeah. I mean, a sort of a hard lesson, I feel like, to be learned about some of the more difficult things that Wolfe did, problematic, representations and with women that we're going to definitely talk about in more detail later on. But yeah, so that being said, I feel like she was one of the most perceptive and creative members of the Earth list.
She sailed a very nice line between people who wanted to read everything literally and people, well, that like me, that tend to spin theories as easily as just talking.
Right. We also, in this chapter, I think it's fair to say, get all of the clues to really figure out pretty distinctly that the tower is a rocket, a ship of some kind, spaceship. And I think he talks about the bulkhead. In fact, right in the same sentence where he names the Mattachin Tower, he talks about a bar of iron sticking out from the bulkhead. He also has, when he has his vision, when he's in the river later on, he's talking about
with Master Malrubius and the spoon.
Yep. And was banging on
the metal walls,
and he talks about thinking that he's in his bunk.
And all the windows are called and doors are called portals and ports, right?
Portals, yeah. So that's
no one ever went to the head, but
yeah.
How long did it take you? How many times did you read it before you finally said, "Wait a minute"?
I think it was the second time I read it when it clicked for me. So the very first time I read it, I thought it was fantasy because of the cover, and I didn't get very far before I quit. I wasn't paying attention, but the second time, I remember when I actually did start paying attention. I can't remember if it was the bulkhead or the ports, but I remember one of those two made me click and sort of sit up and pay attention and start looking for things after that.
It's his language that he has a way of describing things that if you saw them, you'd recognize them immediately. But the way he describes them, they sound peculiar. They sound obscure.
This is maybe not the best time to talk about it, but But it's one thing that I love that Wolfe does is, you mentioned describing when he does these things, especially when he presents something as, matter of fact, whether it's the flyer in chapter 1, he doesn't come out and stop and sort of make you focus on it. It's always something that is presented as, very normal to the person. Like in that sentence, the way he says it is, in our Matachin Tower, a certain bar of iron thrust from a bulkhead at the height of a man's groin. He's not sitting there specifically describing the bulkhead. He's describing this piece of iron, right? But it's just you're like, oh, let me point out this iron that's on the bulkhead over there. The thing that you really should be paying attention to right there, of course, is that he just said bulkhead, but it's just presented as sort of common knowledge. And I think it's things like that make it so easy to miss.
Well, he likes telling his stories in first person, but he never breaks character. I guess that's part of the flavor of pretty much all of the stories, is that he adopts a perspective and he sticks with it. I remember one time someone talking about that if normal modern writing were written the way a lot of science fiction is written, you'd have a guy, I got in my car, my 1958 Chevrolet with new air conditioning, controls on directly on the dash. I put it in fifth gear that branched off of fourth and fifth, and it would just go on and on where you describe every little detail of technology that's quite obvious to the person who is telling the story. But Wolfe doesn't do that. He makes us try to see things from their eyes.
Which means glossing over all kinds of background things.
Exactly.
Because we don't notice it when we're in that same situation. You asked about the Matachin Tower. One thing I think is interesting here is that the chapter really has two parts. And the second part is the really dramatic part that we get referred to in the first chapter. But he doesn't even start with that dramatic part. The first half of the chapter is exposition, is background. Severian's actually even talking about his childhood. And it's only after that we find out that right before this whole thing with Vodalus that just happened, Severian had a rather important experience. And do you want to jump straight to do it out of order just a little bit and talk about the river?
Yeah, okay. We know he nearly drowned. And now he says that he never went to the Gyol again after that day.
On that point, some people do say that that's either a lie or another memory fail, because, of course, he does come back to the river. He has to cross it to get out, and he rides on it again. But I think it's pretty clear that what he means here is that he doesn't come back with the other boys to go swimming, because he mentions, they commented on it a couple times, and that Yadi even guessed the reason. So I think he just means with the other apprentices.
The Gyol is bordered on either side with stone, and its surface is covered in nenuphars. Nenuphars are a blue-blossomed water lily. Usually its name is applied to the Egyptian lotus, which is connected to resurrection.
So thinking about those, the nenuphars, I looked for all kinds of pictures of lotuses and water lilies and things like that. It was really hard to find straight blue ones. There were a few. So this is a total tangent, but one thing I started thinking about was, okay, anytime that he mentions colors, we have a red sun, which is darker. I started to really wonder, okay, when Severian presents a color, is that actually the color that we recognize with that?
Wow, that would be rough.
I mean, that might be reading too far, but I was really thinking, okay, everything's kind of red shifted a little bit. And so I was thinking, so for him to call the flower blue, does that mean that it really is a different color, or what he's seeing as blue is something else? And I didn't actually work it out yet. And I'm not sure that actually works out perfectly, but it did make me wonder, because there are a number of times that color comes up in this chapter.
Well, the choice of the color is kind of interesting. Because why make it blue? He doesn't. It could be many colors. Lotuses are generally white, right?
White. Yeah. White. So, and I think one thing that, with the benefit of hindsight and having read a whole lot of other stuff, and, I'll just leave a plug in here with some other things that I know you've thought about and read about. Blue and green are important colors in this chapter. The nenuphars are blue, and Juturna is green. When we finally see the Undine come up, her face is as green as moonshine, like the green moonshine.
I've read this so many times, I've never even put those two together, even though, and I've compiled lists of all the places that blue and green shows up.
In some other stuff that you talk about what, not only just the fact that Wolfe will often pair blue and green together. And of course you have Short Sun, where there are planets just called blue and green, and
Fifth Head of Cerberus, we have planets that are blue,
exactly,
and
blue and green. And one thing that I think that's also something that may not happen all the time, but often blue and green are sort of coded as, if not quite good and evil, at least sort of like advanced and degenerate or something like that. And so I was just trying to figure out, okay, knowing that Wolfe has this blue and green pair, Juturna has saved Severian and she's green. Eventually the green man is going to be the one who is, an evolved form of humanity. The lotuses are blue, and Severian talks about them as, even though he's about to die underneath them, he kind of refers to them, and he even says, when I think of my own death or the death of someone who has been kind to me, or even the death of the sun, the image that comes to my mind is that of the nenuphar with its glossy pale leaves and azure flower. It's an ambiguous memory because it's of his own death, but then a death of someone who was kind to him, which could be a good thing, but also be very sad. And so it seems like blue in this case, I don't know, it seems like it's supposed to be pretty negative, I would think. And then later, Juturna is the one who saves him. She is green, and so that's a good thing that she saves him. But we also find out, of course, that the Undines they're the enemy of the Autarch.
They're the wives of Abaya, right?
Yeah, and against the new sun. No real point to that other than to say that the fact that blue and green are paired here, and the ambiguity of sort of figuring out, well, is blue or green a better color? Is there one that you would want to have? I just found it interesting that it's not that we don't get that. It's not like in Short Sun where, green is dangerous, blue is beautiful.
Well, fifth head of Cerberus, Saint Anne is green, and it's kind of a fairyland place where Saint Croix is blue, and it's kind of more urban and more Earth-like. But and then green in the Book of the Short Sun is a dangerous jungle, and blue is settled. I don't know. To think if there's a pattern to that.
So that made me stop too and think, how does Severian actually think of the nenuphars here? He says he never came back to the river because of the flowers, and he says that Yada had guessed that it was because of the nenuphars, and other people thought he was just afraid of the water, but it was really the flowers that scared him and that kept him away. But once you find out that, this is a lotus, this is a flower that is a symbol of rebirth and a symbol of, something that always can return, that can always repurify itself. And it's also, this is a point where Severian has not only suffered something scary, but he's also been, saved at the same time. That made me wonder, like it seems like if the lotus is traditionally this kind of peaceful promise of a kind of ongoing eternity or ongoing regeneration, then why is it something that scares him so much?
Yeah, that's really, I tell you the truth, I've never put the blue blossoms of the water lily and her green face together. Although, why wouldn't I?
Okay, I got us way off track. So let's get back to the purple flowers of the necropolis.
He says that most people consider them ugly, but Severian says he likes them. The necropolis has never seemed a city of death to me. I know its purple roses, which other people think so hideous, shelter hundreds of small animals and birds. The executions I have seen performed and performed myself are often no more than a tread, a butchery of human beings who are, for the most part, less innocent and less valuable than cattle. When I think of my own death or the death of someone who has been kind to me, or even the death of the sun, the image that comes to my mind is that of the nenuphar, with its glossy, pale leaves and azure flower. Under flower and leaves are black roots as fine and strong as hair, reaching down into the dark waters. It's an insight into his character that he says, when I think of the death of someone who is my own death or the death of someone who has been kind to me. So it's bittersweet or sad. He thinks of the nenuphars, and it's beautiful, but it's also, he doesn't speak of someone I love, which is an insight into his own personality.
He talks about how that the flowers shelter, hundreds of small animals. And so it's not an image of death for him.
Right.
Which, because it seems odd, because then he does go on to say, well, it is an image of death, but it's good death, or at least it's not tragic death in different ways.
Yeah, he likes them because they remind him of his own death or the death of a nice person or the death of the sun. It's very morbid. But what do you expect from a kid who hangs out in a mausoleum?
I guess the thing to take away from this is that Severian is not presenting death early in this book as particularly tragic. He hasn't really explained why yet, but even though he can seem very cold and he does talk about butchery of human beings, there's still something about death that holds promise that he's going to explore.
So they go to the gill to swim. There are other groups hanging out on the banks, and no one invites them because they're torturers. But they don't feel comfortable telling these baby torturers to get lost either. So the boys pick a place, and whoever is there eventually just wanders off, leaving the spot to them. And this time, Severian dives into the water, as he has so many other times, and he gets lost in the darkness under the roots. He gets tangled in the tendrils of the roots. He knows that he will soon drown, and he hears a clanging. He sees a vision of Master Malrubius, who had died several years earlier, waking them up in the morning by banging a spoon on, as we said, the bulkhead of their room. He's banging for Severian to wake up, and he's lying in his cot, but he's unable to move. Malrubius is looking for him, but he can't find him because Severian is on a table in one of the cells below the, quote, examination room, the torture chamber, looking up at a gray ceiling, metal ceilings. He says, I lay there on my back, looking up at the gray ceiling. A woman cried, but I could not see her, and I was less conscious of her sobs than the ringing of the spoon. Darkness closed over me, but out of the darkness came the face of a woman, as immense as the green face of the moon. It was not she who wept. I could hear the sobs still, and the face was untroubled, and indeed filled with that kind of beauty that hardly admits of expression. Her hands reached toward me, and at once I became a fledgling I had taken from its nest on my finger, for her hands were each as long as the coffins in which I sometimes rested in my mausoleum.
So one thing I just wanted to say about that sentence that I think is so cool is that he immediately becomes like a fledgling, like a very young bird. But then he describes her fingers also as the coffin. And so to me, that's just so cool that in that one sentence, you have this image of youth and death, like right there, all at this moment,
Yeah.
Which, if this is, like a moment of resurrection, of him being brought back to life, works perfectly. But yeah, I just wanted to point that out, that's one of my favorite sentences from this.
And this is the first time that he mentions that the moon is green.
Yes.
And he just moves along, and he'll have someone spell it out for us later on when he goes to the library.
And again, is another one of those moments where you're supposed to be surprised by a giant face that's right there. And the fact that he says the moon is green is just, again, sort of common knowledge for Severian. Yeah. So fun.
I definitely didn't think of it a moment when I said it. It never occurred to me that, wait a minute, I've never seen a green moon. Her hands are almost 2 meters long. She grabs him and flings him down, what he thinks is downward, to the muddy bottom of the river. And then he bursts the bottom of the river to the surface of the river. He got confused about up and down, and he couldn't see the surface through the nenuphars. Drota grabs him by the hair and drags him to the shore. Although he's conscious, he requires mouth-to-mouth from Drota and Rosha to breathe on his own. A woman brings him something, soup or tea, but it is so hot he can't drink it, and later notices that it scalded his lips where he had tried. Everyone is shocked over how Severian flew up out of the water. I guess he looked like a dolphin or something. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Severian says he saw Master Malrubius, and an old man asks Rocha who Malrubius is, and he explains that he was the master of the torturers, and he's now dead. And the man says, not a woman? Blah, 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 blah.
Right. So, of course, there's supposed to be, other people are aware that there are undines in the river, or at least legends about them have been passed around.
So it takes a long time before Severian is able to get up and walk home, and that is why, in Chapter 1, they were late getting back home that night.
So this brings up a lot of questions that I know people have argued about for a long time about a couple things. First is, Did Severian actually die here? Was Juturna then the one who we don't get her name Juturna here, but we find out later it's Juturna. Was she the one that brought him back? Was something else doing it? And you had mentioned before that when we were talking that there is a scene in Earth of the New Sun where Juturna shows him the skeleton, or is it just his skull?
No, he's just walking along in the bottom of the. It's after the flood of the earth, and he's walking along the bottom, and he comes across the skeleton of a young boy, and he imagines that this could have been a boy just like me. And if you've read Wolfe, very very much at all, then that your mind immediately is going to go to the idea that, wait a minute, is Wolfe hinting that this is actually him?
He does actually say he has a memory of being thrown to the bottom of the river.
Yeah.
So, I mean, so maybe he didn't get it wrong. But so that's one of the questions, did Severian actually die? Is this metaphorical death? If he was resurrected, how was he resurrected? Was it some other power? Was it Severian himself who was able to resurrect himself? All those questions immediately come up.
And there is a scene where at one point he dies, and suddenly, and then the I guess I can't remember which level it is. The Hierogrammates basically creates a duplicate of him and resurrects him, and he continues on his journey, and which once again leads to the idea that he could have done that many times.
Yeah. So the other thing that comes up is that, first of all, the question is the vision that he has in Master Malrubius, was this a hallucination, or is all of that dream and vision that's going on something else? Because we find out later that there is an eidolon or an aquaster of Malrubius that's wandering around, and one of the questions is what he sees actually that same Malrubius? And but then also the question of what is it that he's dreaming about here? Why the clanging, and why was it a spoon that Malrubius is banging things with? Who's the woman who he hears crying? Is that supposed to be sort of a premonition of Thecla,
or his mother is another memory?
Exactly. And what I think is too is that it's a woman crying. Well, actually, now that you mentioned that if it could be his mother, that actually works even better if you immediately then have Juturna show up as a woman who is connected to a sort of new moment of life, because then it means she's also sort of like another mother, who's in some ways giving him life again.
If you were to take a few cognitive leaps and say, okay, so Severian died when he has a memory of her flinging him down to the bottom of the river, but then he has a memory of being thrown up into the top. So imagine him at an examination room, and he sees Malrubius. He's being told, wake up, wake up, wake up. And he hears crying, which could just as well be Juturna or someone else crying over his, the fact that he's dead. In which case, all of this is not just a hallucination, but an actual memory.
Reading it this time, that was my sort of assumption. It felt to me like this has to be memories that he's going on. Partly, if for no other reason, then also because the first sentence of the chapter is "memory oppresses me," So everything about this made me think, okay, it's not a dream, it's not a hallucination, it's not a metaphorical thing of what's going on. That these are probably just actual memories that he's having at that moment. Maybe, but it did make me start to think, okay, so is that the same Severian? Is this a different one who has been resurrected a second time? I don't know, but that was one thing I felt more sure about this time, that what he's doing here is having an actual memory.
That would be very apt, because it is probably more common than not that that Wolfe will have a character say something that everyone takes to be a metaphor or a hallucination, but is an actual. But he means it literally.
So what I want to do is find out, when did these things happen? Especially if, asking about his resurrection gets us into those questions of, well, have there been multiple Severians, multiple resurrections? Especially if you're reading this for the first time, you're not at all prepared to know, where in any kind of timeline, he might have had that memory.
Exactly.
But that's one thing I'm going to be looking out for.
Do you want to talk about Juturna a little bit, or you want to talk about something?
Yeah. So we don't get her name. We don't even know anything about the Undines, really.
Right. But we eventually find out she's like a wife or a consort of, who knows what that means, of an alien power named Abaya. And
Right.
Abaya the name comes from a Malaysian mythological monster. It's a giant eel that lives at the bottom of lakes, and is said to consider all creatures in the lake its children and protects them furiously against anyone who would harm or disturb them. So the aliens are typically thought to be named after monsters, but they're complicated. And all throughout, when you get to the long sun, short sun cycle, the alien being Skilla, it becomes something of an ally. Abaya obviously he's complicated. It's not really clear what his relationship is. Erebus does seem to be always treated as a much more darker force. As his name would fit for.
And I have to just throw this out there, even though they're giants, but it always also made me wonder, is this where Wolfe is doing a moment of Lovecraft, just especially since they're based in Antarctica? That immediately
They are so Lovecraftian. In An Evil Guest, which is I think he may even dedicate the book in part to Lovecraft. You have these creatures. You have a giant undersea creature. He just as in this case, Vodalus will later claim to work for Erebus and Abaya, and even in that novel, they have all of these agents in the government, different people who are working for some alien power or another. But this whole thing kind of reminds me also of the Latro stories, the Soldier in the Mist, Soldier of Arete, where all the gods seem to be trying to recruit him to their cause in a war that is just out of sight. You don't really know what their motivations are, but you know that they want him on their side.
Yeah. One other thing I wanted to say about this part is that there is a thematic repetition that comes up over and over here. I'm still stuck on the idea that the first chapter is called Resurrection and Death, and that there's so many things, even still in this chapter, that are always talking about how there's constant resurrection, or there's constant sort of cycles of destruction and creation. By putting the Vodalus chapter first and then coming to this one, we kind of get a sort of a little circle in the narrative here, that we move forward and we move back to move forward again. Something about that just seems right, that since this book is about sort of cycles of, degeneration and then needing to be renewed, that the fact that we get so many images of that, not just with the resurrection itself, but in all kinds of, even at the sentence level, like the one I mentioned, where in one sentence, he is both a young creature and lying in a coffin at the same time. That's there. And even to go back as well to, we haven't really talked about this, and this is an earlier part, but when he says that when he was young, he always had two thoughts that always obsessed him. One was that time would end and everything, the sun would finally wink out. But then the other thing is that there was a light that was constantly sort of engendering life. And that he has both of those thoughts that constantly obsess him. And it's not one or the other that's more important, but that both are there. And that, is just so central to all kinds of things that the book is going to be about.
I write for a living myself. I write nonfiction. I write technical documentation.
Mm-hmm.
And I can see in these first two chapters, Wolfe having written them all probably mostly in chronological order, and then he's just cutting them into pieces and moving them. I'm going to move this here. I'm going to move this here. I want this particular beat here. You can see a lot of revision work in these two chapters. A lot of the scissoring and cut marks and fingerprints all over it.
And he does say too in interviews that he had all 4 books written before he even sent the first to be published.
Yeah, because he wanted to make sure it would come out the way he wanted it to, basically, which is again probably a little shocking to anyone who got to the end of that book and said, "Hey, wait a minute, this book didn't end." He said,
"Yeah,
he was supposed to become the conciliator or the new sun or something."
Well, good. Well, let's go back then to the first part, because we talked about the resurrection and the whole scene in the river. So let's talk about the more expositional portion. And it starts with this wonderful sentence: "Memory oppresses me."
Well, not as much as he supposes.
Yeah.
So at the time the story starts, the guild has 2 masters and less than 20 journeymen. That's apparently fewer than it used to be. So this is a less interesting time. The chapter starts with an explanation of how Severian came to be in the Torturers Guild. In winter, beggars come to their tower hoping to get food and shelter for their willingness to inflict torture. And sometimes they bring dead animals as work samples, but they never get admitted. The only way that they accept new members is at birth or very early. When condemned are sent to them, sometimes they get children along with it. Are whole families being sent to these guys?
That's one of the interesting questions, like, because if you just think about, well, how do they get, that would be a lot of pregnant women that they'd have to get, if they could only have, or pregnant women.
Or if it's shorter than a man's groin, they keep them. So even if they're, 2 or 3 or something like that, then they'll keep them. If it's a girl, then they send them to the witches' keep.
Yeah, and we start to find out here about other guilds. So we learn about the witches, and this is just more of the world building. I think that's one thing we could probably agree that the whole first half of this is really more about world building than, even though we do get some information about Severian, we're really getting a lot more about Nessus.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of exposition in this.
Yeah, even some history. We learn about Ymar, or Ymar, I never know how to pronounce
Ymar
it. Ymar the almost just. Which is, it's funny because he talks about him, he's like, as a leader that people should know. But then later on, he says that was countless hundreds years before.
Right.
He didn't even know exactly how long ago it was, which is fun because there you start to get that sense of, I guess, deep time.
So the witches depend pretty heavily on the Torturers Guild as well in order to get their new recruits. Because when they get a woman who's pregnant and then they perform a cesarean, which is potentially in part where Severian gets his name. The Torturers used to have both men and women, but he says, but Ymar the almost just, observing how cruel the women were and how often they exceeded the punishments he had decreed, ordered that there should be women among the torturers no more. And this is how Wolfe gets accused of being a misogynist.
And I wonder too, one thing that stood out to me this time that I never noticed was how there's another image right there that comes out that he may be suggesting that the torturers are foolishly masculine in certain ways. And the thing that stood out to me was, it's like how they choose the boys, how that what he says, that there's in our Matterton Tower, there's a certain bar of iron that thrusts from the bulkhead at the height of a man's groin, and kids who are shorter than that they keep. Well, to say that there's a bar of iron sticking out at the height of a man's groin, it's a pretty obvious what you're supposed to be sort of imagining there. And to say that we judge people as whether they're going to come to our place by this penis is just sort of, it makes me think, is there a suggestion here that he's aware of sort of this gender stuff that's going on?
You must be no higher than the bar of iron.
It's funny, but it also I think undercuts that thing about the women were just bad. Also he says this is a degenerate age.
Yeah.
And that's one of the lines that at one point.
Well, it's not this. It's a dubious criticism to say that you're unsuitable to be a torturer. So
yeah, so that's one passage that I think gets thrown out a lot of times as one of the sort of areas where his misogyny becomes an issue, but also with some of the characterizations later on. But I think and I'll still be out there. I think there's some places where it may be a justified criticism. This is not one, I think, and even then, it's there's a lot going on. is I guess one way to put it. That I don't think it. Even Wolfe, I don't think there's a stretch to say that he was probably in the end a little more fond of traditional male and female roles and sort of gender ideas with some things, and I think he'd be fine with that. So there is that sort of strain to him, but it's not what I think a lot of people will complain about, because I think the complaints are often too simplistic.
Well, so there are some places, and we'll get to them, I know, where you can say, wait, why is this scene in here?
But I think too, we were talking about first person before. My reaction with Wolfe is always, well, let's give him benefit of the doubt, and if there is a passage that is clearly sort of anti-feminist or something like that, let's assume that he did that intentionally to tell us something about the character, and let's see what happens then.
Yeah.
Like, is that something that the character is going to have to deal with later on, and that'll come back to bite him? And that actually, I think that happens in a few places.
Well, this narrator is not a perfect man. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. But I think that is something that's important to bring up, just because it is probably the most common criticism of Wolfe, and this is one area that, since it's right there at the beginning,
Yeah.
that gets mentioned a lot.
So yeah, no one knows. So no one knows, because of the way they come into the Torturers Guild. No one knows their lineage. Everyone imagines that he's the son of an exultant, and Severian likes to think that he is. He feels like he's taller than average, but we will find out that he is not an exultant. We get some layout of the general area of the Torturer's Tower. There's an old yard next to the tower where Severian played as he was little. The Witch's Keep is northeast of the yard, adjacent to the Torturer's area. There's something called a Grand Court that is part of the Witches' area near the Witch's Keep. It's interesting that the witches live in a keep and not a tower. I don't know if that means it's a different kind of structure or not. The Madachin Tower is up against the curtain wall that encircles the citadel. Then there's space between the Madachin Tower and the Red Tower and the Bear that are apparently also up against the curtain wall. The Red Tower are the fighters, and the Bear are animal handlers that raise fighting animals. In the space between the Madachin Tower and the Red Tower, the curtain wall is collapsed. It's fallen slabs of unsmeltable gray metal, which sounds very sturdy.
Sturdy and science fiction-y, and I was thinking about that word, like unsmeltable, because that's one of those points where I think you're assuming fantasy because of Citadel, and then you go to science fiction. But then I was thinking unsmeltable, like what that actually means. And it's not like, I think when I first read it, even on the reread, I just thought unmeltable, like, super sturdy. But unsmeltable means something different. It means that you couldn't make the metal. You couldn't smelt it. You couldn't.
Well, it's a little bit like unmeltable in that you couldn't take it and remake it into something else. It's right. You're going to heat it up and heat it up and heat it up, and maybe it just never even gets hot.
Right. So, but that's another thing that sort of makes me think: is this alien? Is this some kind of or future tech? That's going way different. But it's just another one of those moments. Feels like a key into a whole bigger world.
Given that there is this breakdown in the wall in the that leads to the necropolis. Right. Why do they even have a guard at the Barbican?
Exactly.
Anyone could wander in.
And all kinds of questions. It seems so, so impervious, and yet something has knocked it over,
Yeah.
And so, and they've built the whole Citadel wall, obviously as a protective thing, and it didn't work. So yeah, you wonder like what were these creatures? Is that the Undines? Is that the monsters?
Yeah. Or maybe it's just even age. I don't know. If the ground shifts, and even no matter how strong the metal is, it's gonna crack and break. The earth is bigger. And the guard at the Barbican, still guarding when they've got this big gaping hole in the wall. I've worked for a lot of established companies that have a lot of procedures in place, and no one really knows why they're there anymore, but they still do them. So there's a place called the Bell Keep by the river. It has a cistern of water under it, and where they swim, and when they couldn't go to the Gill River, and they're not allowed to swim there, but that's part of the fun. They aren't allowed to go to the Gill either because they aren't allowed outside the Citadel. He says, when we passed those rusting portals, we felt we were for the first time truly outside the Citadel. That's the Necropolis Gate. And thus, in undeniable disobedience of the rules that were supposed to govern our comings and goings, we believed, or pretended to believe, we would be tortured if our older brothers discovered the violation. In actuality, we would have suffered no worse than a beating. Such is the kindness of the torturers whom I was subsequently to betray. Foreshadowing.
So the other thing that's sort of interesting about all of this is that he talks about they were not allowed to leave in certain ways, and it was partly for their own protection because people hated them. So we learn more about, a little bit about the society. But he also says at another point that he thinks that they were kept around to, divert hatred and fear away from the autarch.
Mm-hmm.
I think it does show that he was very aware of, even at a young age, of certain sort of cracks in the society. In other words, he didn't quite believe in all the tales that were being told to him
right.
about the world.
The people fear them, but they also hate them. But whenever they would go out into the town, they would have a famous criminal, then everyone would shout recommendations to them for what they should do. Most of them were obscene and many impossible. So the Citadel is kind of a city within a city. The outer city is called Nessus. Now Severian breaks off. So he starts talking about his childhood. Since the necropolis was so accessible, it was his playground. So there were sentries at graves, but mostly only at the newer graves. Vodalis's people only care about the fresh corpses. The necropolis is said to be the oldest graveyard in Nessus, but Severian says that's not true. But it is really old.
That one part I want to say one thing about, because I feel like that little section, the way he says it, is incredibly Wolfian and something of a key. But he says, just to read that, he says, our necropolis is said to be the oldest in Nessus. That is certainly false. But the very existence of the error testifies to a real antiquity. The autarchs weren't buried there, even though the Citadel was their stronghold, and he goes on and on. But that kind of phrasing of saying one thing, saying it's false, and giving you reason to know it's false, but then finding another way that it's true, just not in a way that you necessarily thought of, that's very Wolfian. And I think it's so cool that he just puts that right there.
The Citadel used to be the stronghold of the autarch, but no autarchs are buried there. We do know from, in the Book of the Short Sun, they go and look for the mausoleum of the family of Typhon. So his family is buried there, but then he's pre-autarch. The exaltants have always been buried at their estates. The prime real estate in the necropolis is near the Citadel curtain wall, and that's where all the armigers and optimates are buried. And an armiger in medieval times was a knight's attendant. It was literally his arm bearer. And an optimate was a conservative senatorial party. The name means, the best sort of people. Perhaps optimates are a kind of political class.
And I think that's another thing that's really important, is that we start to see pretty quickly that there's a hierarchical culture, there are classes, but everything, even where they're buried, has a certain status associated with it. One thing that I think is interesting about that is the Nessus then follows right down through this, and it talks about how it runs down at the bottom through the potter's fields and through the poorer parts. One thing that I had never really thought before, if all of that is running downhill, then when they go down out to the potter's fields to swim in Nessus, they're swimming in some filthy, filthy water. Because that's, of course people would be using the river to wash away trash and sewage. And I don't know, for me, it kind of complicates the resurrection scene a little bit, because you usually think of a baptism or something like that happening in very pristine water. But this is murky, murky stuff, not just because of all the hairs of the nenuphars, but also trash and sewage.
Filthy water doesn't really stop young people from swimming. I grew up about 2 blocks from Lake Erie in the 70s, and we swam there all the time. So just saying.
But yeah, so he describes all of the different levels of the graves. So yeah, we come back to this society that is highly, highly structured. Obviously, one thing I think, the way I feel like he's emphasizing that is not just to teach, or not just to say that it's hierarchical, but actually it sort of has a sort of stagnant feel to it. That especially once he describes how people are put in the guilds, it's sort of like, there you are, that's your life. Fate sort of assigns it to you and you just stay there. So it seems like a very dead kind of system.
Yeah. Even when you die, it's very clear where you stand.
Exactly.
The graveyard is full of cypresses. I don't know if the cypresses are like the Louisiana swamp kind or the manicured topiary kind. The boys, of course, as we said, don't know their lineage, but then they make up their past to fill in the blanks. Iada drew a coat of arms from one of the northern clans above his bed. Severian adopted a coat of arms that he found at a mausoleum, and where he hung out, and he decided that was his own. Everyone had their own private haunts in the necropolis. This coat of arms was a fountain rising above waters and a ship volant. It's a technical term, volant. It's from heraldry. It basically means flying. Why not just say flying? And at the bottom, a rose.
Yeah. So, I mean, you have to stop here for a while. And, these are the kinds of things that he chooses. But of course, everything that we said in the first chapter about how symbols make us what we are, to choose these symbols is obviously incredibly significant. So just to stop for a little bit with the three of them, the fountain rising above waters. I mean, and one thing too I think is interesting is these aren't necessarily, to me at least, perfectly clear images apart from the rose. That the fountain rising above waters and the ship Volant, the way he describes them are ambiguous in a way that is always a little frustrating to me, but also kind of telling, or at least significant, because a fountain rising above waters, I think there's been a lot of people who assume that really what that is ultimately kind of a symbol of the new sun coming through, or eventually, I know some people have talked about how that they feel like this is somehow connected to the black hole that's supposed to go inside the sun to bring it back to life.
The white hole. The white hole.
Yeah, excuse me. Yes, exactly. The white hole. And that is absolutely part of it. But of course, also a fountain rising above waters, like huge waters can stand for the flood.
Well, is the fountain underneath the waters? Is that
that's one of my questions. I mean, he says they were a fountain rising above water. So is the fountain the actual water, like a huge spray of water coming up? Is the fountain itself like a structure that's coming above the waters? Again, he doesn't describe them. He just sort of says these things and moves on. So the same thing like a ship Volant, like you mentioned, he puts Volant in italics. One of the few things he does, he throws it in italics, which to me sort of initially makes me think exactly like you said, that he's just sort of talking about it like a technical term. But to be a ship flying is then, I think initially we're all going to think of ships with sails, but we've also just in the last chapter seen a ship that actually does fly, a spaceship. So we don't know what kind of ship this actually is. He mentions these three things, but then leaves it really unclear as to exactly how we're supposed to picture them, I think.
First of all, when you get to the end of these 4 volumes, it's not going to be perfectly clear what these symbols mean.
Yeah.
Although he talks about them like we're supposed to be told. The fountain, okay, that's the white hole, but that's not really spelled out to us until we get to Earth of the New Sun, which was not originally intended to be explained. Right. The waters, I think Michael Andre Idrisi wrote an article. I think it was in the same one from in the same magazine where Gaiman first talked about how to read Wolfe, where he talks about what Wolfe expects of his readers. And this is the first reference to the fact that there's going to be a flood. But although there's a lot of little hints like this, that the coming of the new sun was going to cause these gravitational waves that would flood the earth, you couldn't settle on that in exclusion of all the other possibilities. And so you have a fountain. Okay, we now know probably the white hole, the waters, the flood, the flying ship. Well, we'll encounter that flying ship in Earth of the New Sun. He'll ride on that. And at the bottom, a rose, which is, I guess, a sun, Wolfe has said that's a sun symbol. But what's really interesting here is the question, is he looking at his real coat of arms when he sees these devices? Or do they become his coat of arms because he encountered them? In other words, does he go back in time and this is his real coat of arms, or does he die and is he buried there? He mentions that he feels like the guy looks a lot like him.
Yeah, that he looks like him. Yep.
Although when he describes him, he looks like any sort of mummified dead man.
Yeah.
But or is it because he's encountered these symbols and he attaches their meaning throughout his life and it affects his life? And once again, we have the situation of symbols creating us.
And I think that's, especially the first time you read it, it's still an open question. But I actually do I still like to read this without Earth of the New Sun in mind if I can, because it sometimes things about Earth feel like cheating. I don't know, but I want to know too, what are we supposed to think when we read this for the first time? How are we supposed to react to these symbols after, like you said, just having in the last chapter, we were told that symbols make us, even if we don't understand what they are. And that's pretty significant to me because I feel like it, at least the first time you read through, it's almost as if saying, maybe there wasn't initially here a destiny, but Severian started because he took these not just because he randomly took these symbols on, but because he felt like he had some kind of reason to choose these, or these were symbols that would have some resonance with something that he felt like he needed or his world needed or something like that.
No, as he says in the beginning, it's possible I had some presentiment of my future.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
The door of the mausoleum is off its hinges. There are 2 empty coffins and 3 unopened ones. There's an open coffin with the remains of a man in it. As we said, he says he has heavy-lidded eyes, and he thinks, "Oh, that looks like me." He's got a straight nose, deep-set eyes. Well, that's what they all look like eventually. sunken cheeks. Oh, well, at least we get an idea of what Severian looks like.
Yeah.
While he's sitting out there, there's a little scene that he describes looking out the little window at animals going about their business. I have a theory about this scene. It kind of ties into your question about gates in chapter 1. And so, maybe one day we'll go over it. But after that, he goes into a paragraph that's all foreshadowing. A moment suffices to describe these things, for which I watched so long. The decades of a Saros would not be enough for me to write all they meant to the ragged apprentice boy I was. 2 thoughts that were nearly dreams obsessed me and made them infinitely precious. The first was that some not distant time itself would stop. The colored days that had so long been drawn forth like a chain of conjurers' scarves come to an end. The sullen sun wink out at last. The second was that there existed somewhere a miraculous light, which I sometimes conceived as a candle, sometimes as a flambeau, that engendered life in whatever object it fell upon, so that a leaf plucked from a bush grew slender legs and waving feelers, and a rough brown bush opened black eyes and scurried up a tree.
So I really like that part. I think it's still a little weird that a little kid would be having these kinds of, like extreme sort of metaphysical types of things, which he says are interestingly revisions and that were nearly dreams, but not dreams. That's another sort of good, fun way to put that. One seems the fact that time would end and everything would just stop. To me, it seems like that. I get where that comes from how he's just spent all this time describing his society, of how stagnant it is, how, there's really not going to be much change in his life. It seems like things have kind of been the way they are for countless hundreds of years. And so the idea that time would stop seems kind of like it's already in many ways stopped, I think, for him, that they're pretty much already at the death. It's the second one, though, that, of course, I kind of want to know, well, where did that come from? Was it just hope? Or was that presentiment? I don't know. I really feel this time like Wolfe is sort of putting it out there in a couple ways with the symbols, with this, of really asking in what way is Severian destined for what's going to happen, and or was this more chance? I don't know. That's a bigger question. But one other thing I do want to point out is that what happens when that miraculous light falls on things is a kind of evolution. From other stuff, we know that Wolfe was actually really fascinated with different theories of evolution and considered himself a Lamarckian. We don't have to get into a lot of it right now, but Lamarck is basically more about adaptation than the sort of natural selection that Darwin had. The idea that, over centuries, right, if you use a trait or use an ability, then that's going to get passed on. That's Lamarck's idea. So it's more adapting instead of just the chance of natural selection. But that's not what he gives here, because here it's sort of that miracle that vegetable type things become animal. And that's a big jump. That's not just evolution. That's a huge jump where, a leaf grows legs and feelers, and a rough brown brush open black eyes and scurried up a tree. And the one thing I think of here, especially with the leaf, is that we get later that green man, where humanity has figured out how to, survive much better, just living directly off the sun.
The reader wouldn't know it the first time going through, but what we have here are 2 potential futures for Earth. I would guess whatever happens to the sun would not matter. It wouldn't wink time itself out, but for the Earth it would. And
I think that's supposed to be Master Ash's world.
Right. He's going to encounter Master Ash, who lives in a different timeline where the new sun didn't come, an alternate future. Or this other one with a new sun. And surely somebody who is reading Shadow the Torturer the first volume in the Book of the New Sun is going to say, oh, okay, now I'm starting to hear reference to this new sun that was in the title. He says, a decades of a Saros would not be long enough for me to write all these meant. A Saros cycle is a period that's just under 19 years between successive lunar and solar eclipses that occur when the sun, earth, and moon are in the same positions relative to one another. So the decades of a Saros are two, or just under two. He's saying that this represents his first 19, 18 years.
And at that point?
And at that point, we head off to the Yule River in this chapter.
So that's a lot. There's a lot packed into one chapter, and two separate little chapters, I think, is kind of what it feels like. But then, of course, I want to know, well, we've just talked about how there were two visions that he had, and we also kind of have two parts of this chapter. So it makes me wonder if in some ways that vision, Earth as it is now is sort of that world where time has stopped. But then we get a story of resurrection where, Severian encounters a giant woman and he's, thrown into the world.
Well, that's true. These are two visions, one of death and one of resurrection.
Yeah. So it works. And what I think is interesting, too, is the title of the chapter is just Severian. So if you take all the weight of that sort of symbolic stuff that we just talked about, maybe the whole chapter has those two
Thanks a lot.
futures. It just the Earth just sort of stagnates as it is, or it becomes different. This chapter isn't called Death and Resurrection, and that would seem more logical if that fits, right? Instead, it's called Severian. And so Severian...
Well, if you think about the name, it just occurs to me is that it's a name that implies a splitting.
Mm-hmm.
And Severian represents a division in which things could go one way or another,
right.
Two alternative futures.
Right.
And I guess it's going to come up when he gets Terminus Est, which supposedly means the line that divides.
Different kind of severing that happens with that sword for most of its use, of course. So that actually makes a lot more sense for why this chapter might be called Severian, because that was one thing that was bothering me. I mean, of course, it's sort of all about him for the first time. We get his background, so it makes sense to call it Severian, but when the first one just has that obvious sort of symbolic resonance, why is this one just Severian? But thinking about his name and severing, like you said, that makes a lot of sense to me.
If you assume that he did die at the bottom of that river,
mm-hmm.
and then he was resurrected in another way, once again, you have a meaning to the name Severian there at the bottom of that river.
Yeah, it works better than I thought it did. See, I knew there'd be an answer. There had to be something there. Well, good. Well, that's a lot for chapter 2.
We're going to let Severian dry out a little bit, and next week we'll work on chapter 3.
So again, please feel free to leave comments, questions, disagreements on all the social media that we have, the Twitter account, ReReading Wolfe, the ReReading Wolfe podcast on Facebook. We'll respond there, but also try to mention you in the podcast and respond to your ideas at that point.
It's undoubtable that we got some things wrong here, and I want to hear about them. So please respond and let us know what I did wrong, what I said wrong.
Absolutely. Tell us what James said wrong.
And if you like what you hear, leave a rating. Whatever you do, be sure and leave a comment.
And if you do, we'll read your review here, just like we said we would for our one review so far at the beginning of the show.
And this is from a listener named Marble Fortress. The reader says, whether you're reading your first Gene Wolfe story or revisiting an old favorite, this is the book club style podcast you need in your life. It makes no illusions that it will, or that it is indeed possible to, avoid spoilers chapter to chapter concerning a writer such as this. And from the first chapter, it is made clear that the reader is expected to know the ending. However, this chosen style only illuminates a book that, if read alone, is strange, winding, mysterious, and very rewarding, if difficult to get through. It is only by putting all the pieces of the novel, The Shadow of the Torturer, together that the first story can be unfolded. That is the service these hosts provide. Each episode is charming, fascinating, and easy on the ears. Well, that's very gratifying.
Very kind. Thank you very much for that. Otherwise, thank you guys for listening. We'll see you in chapter 3.
Between the body at the bottom That body is my own reflection. But it ain't hip to sink that low unless you're gonna make a resurrection. They're always gonna come to your door. They're gonna say it's just a routine inspection. But what do you get when you open your door? What you get is just another injection. And there's always gonna be one more with just a little bit less until the next one. They wait in shadows and steal light from your eyes. To them, vision's just some costly infection. But you should come with me. I'm the fire's reflection. I'm just a constant warning to take the other direction. Mister, I am your connection. 'Cause when the city drops into the night, before the darkness has one moment of light, that's when everything seems clear. The other side, it seems so near. What seems so wrong? I think it's gonna be right. Before the city drops, the city goes down into the night. Into the night.
If we get into some sort of rambling wild fight, that's what we're looking for. If we have to cut something out, then we should cut out all of the cool exposition.